In 1533, Anne Boleyn marries the King of England. To get to this point, she has to maintain the king's interest in her for 6 years while he struggles unsuccessfully to get a divorce from his existing wife, Catherine of Aragon. But eventually, against all odds, Anne Boleyn succeeds. Catherine of Aragon is divorced. King Henry VIII marries her, and he puts the crown of England on her head. It must have seemed a bit like a Cinderella story, a happily ever after. But this is the story of the fall of Anne Boleyn. And happily ever after is not quite how it goes. You're listening to Villains and Virgins podcast, and this is the 3rd episode in our series on Henry VIII. In this episode, we're going to cover the chapter of the story that involves the fate of Anne Boleyn. But let's just back up and remember how we got here. In the last episode, we saw how Henry VIII had drastically changed England in order to change his queen. In his determination to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, he had been led into a most unlikely position. You see, up until this point, England had been an entirely Catholic country, with a very outspoken Catholic king. Henry VIII had even authored a pamphlet defending the faith and the Pope against the dangerous ideas of the Protestant Reformation as penned by Martin Luther. Those ideas, and that troublesome German monk Martin Luther, would eventually lead to a permanent split in the Christian church and the beginnings of what we now know as Protestant Christianity. But at this moment in time, Martin Luther is just a troublesome critic, and Henry VIII, the King of England, sees himself as a champion of the existing order and a defender of the faith against these dangerous ideas. And so for this particular man, this particular king, Henry VIII, who had been so staunchly against Protestant ideas, to turn around 180 degrees and make England a Protestant country is something that is truly astonishing. And yet this is exactly what he ends up doing when the Pope refuses to give him a divorce from his existing wife and queen, Catherine of Aragon. But Henry is absolutely bent on having a divorce because Catherine has been unable to produce a son, although she's been married to Henry for many years and is now past childbearing age. And without a male heir, the potential for civil war looms over England once again because the Tudor dynasty will very likely not survive. And as other contending nobles would possibly compete for the throne, England would be torn apart by a civil war, which was a fairly recent memory still. And so Henry is determined to change his wife and marry someone who can produce this much sought-after male heir. In this pursuit, Henry separates England from the authority of the existing institutional church and the Pope. He makes himself the head of the Church of England, and he makes England a Protestant country. His new queen, Anne Boleyn, is also a Protestant. Now, marrying Anne Boleyn caused a lot of controversy. One of the reasons it was so controversial is because Henry's divorce caused insult to a much-loved queen, Catherine of Aragon. And while she had been born a Spanish princess, she had been the Queen of England for many years and was extremely popular amongst her subjects. So she had now been put away, and her entire marriage to Henry had been declared illegitimate. It also meant that her child, Princess Mary, was also regarded as a bastard, as no longer in line for the English throne. Instead, she'd been replaced with Anne Boleyn, someone who was often referred to by people in England as the Great Whore. Of course, you wouldn't use that language in the presence of one of Henry's officials because there was punishment that had been prepared for people who weren't willing to formally and officially accept Anne Boleyn as the legitimate Queen of England. But in private, make no mistake about it, people had a very low opinion of her. Now, if Henry had divorced Catherine, risking serious political consequences with Spain, a very powerful country in Europe at the time, which he had offended by putting away Catherine. If he'd put her away in favor of another fertile woman, a princess from a different European country who could bring a political alliance to replace what had been lost with Spain, that's something that, while distasteful, a lot of people would have understood. The realities of dynastic preservation and the need for a male heir were things that even Spain could eventually have been brought round to recognizing the need for. But Henry hadn't replaced Catherine with another political alliance. Henry replaced Catherine with another woman that he was widely regarded to have uncontrollable lust for. And so it wasn't so much the fact that Henry got a divorce that was so controversial. It was who he replaced his wife with. Now, internationally, Henry's action was regarded with disgust and disbelief by many observers. Unsurprisingly, the Spanish took a dim view of Henry's decision, but that was, of course, because his divorced wife was a Spanish princess. But even for the Germanic Holy Roman Empire, another major political contender at the time, there were expressions of disbelief at what Henry had done. I have a quote from one of the ambassadors of the Holy Roman Empire, and they're on record as saying, quote, "Scarcely one courtier can be found who does not despise him for this relationship with Anne, as well as for what he is doing, or trying to do, against his honor and conscience." Another ambassador writes to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, quote, "As far as I can hear and judge, this king's obstinacy and his passion for the lady are such that there is no chance of recalling him by mildness or fair words to a sense of his duty." Unquote. Attitudes toward the sexes in the 16th century were quite different from our own. The assumption then was that women were vulnerable to overpowering lust, that they were subject to these strong drives towards sexual activity, and that they sometimes lacked the strength of character or the reasoning power to keep themselves in check. And so women could fall victim to these urges at any time. Men, by contrast, while given to lust in their youth, were supposed to be more governed by reason, especially as they got older, and were supposed to be able to master these impulses and have more sober courses of action. Thus, Henry was expected to be master of his own desires, and to choose a wife not only to please himself, but to strengthen England. And it was his perceived failure to do this second part that was the cause of so much disgust. Now, it's hard to speak of male desires and gender roles in 16th century England without digressing for a moment to talk about one of the most bizarre fashions ever to have been seen. At this point in English history, male fashion is far more revealing than anything that women were wearing. If you take a look at images of things that were worn in the Tudor period in England, you see that women are swathed in voluminous drapes of fabric. In fact, the only parts of their bodies that can be seen are their faces, hands, collarbones, and feet. Their hair is covered, and the shape of their bodies is entirely disguised by these masses and masses of fabric. Men, on the other hand, had an entirely different set of fashions. It begins with hose. And what is referred to as hose at the time were extremely tight leggings. Think of them as spandex tights that men wore. So they completely showed all the curves of men's legs, which was quite deliberate. Men were very self-conscious about the shape and the length and the muscles of their legs, and they wore hose so that other people could admire this particular physical feature. In addition to hose, the colors that men wore were far brighter than anything that the women wore. If you look at what the females were wearing, it was mostly dark colors, sober colors, whereas the men are wearing riotous, flamboyant colors, very much like male peacocks in comparison to their female counterparts. And most notable of all, they wore codpieces. If you don't know anything about codpieces, The best way to think of them is like a super padded push-up bra for men's genitalia. They were designed to enlarge, support, and push out this particular aspect of a man's anatomy that is normally understated in fashions today. When you look at paintings of men's clothing in this period, you see these alarming bulges, brightly colored, just protruding from the fabric above the upper thighs, as though these men were walking around with permanent erections. And it wasn't only an upper class thing either, nor was it limited to English fashion. There are paintings by German artist Bruegels that show peasants frolicking, and there are men and women joining hands, dancing in circles, and there are the codpieces jutting out into space on full display. So when we think about the beliefs of this period, which held that men were more sober and governed by reason, whereas women were potentially the victims of wild lust, it's useful to remember that women were completely concealed and draped by the voluminous swaths of fabric they had to drag with them everywhere, whereas men cavorted in brightly colored spandex with apparently huge and permanent erections. So, to return to our story, what made Anne Boleyn so attractive to Henry VIII? Did she just have overwhelming sex appeal? I'm not suggesting that Anne Boleyn was homely or unattractive by any means, only that she wasn't possessed of some overwhelming, irresistible allure that made her outstanding amongst other women. Undoubtedly, she was attractive, but not overwhelmingly so. So she had something else that made her special, something else that managed to retain Henry VIII's interest for 6 long years between the time that he initiated a relationship with her and the time that he made her his wife. What could that have been? Well, the evidence indicates that Anne had a number of things going for her, and one of them was her years in a French court. She was a lady-in-waiting in her teens to Queen Claude, who is the Queen of France, and in the French court, manners and education of women was somewhat different. In fact, there was an emphasis on much more education, reading, and ideas for women. And this was the milieu in which Anne Boleyn develops. And so she's far better read. She's much more able to engage in the kind of intellectual conversations about ideas and theology that Henry VIII is so passionately fond of. Unlike Catherine of Aragon, who was also very well educated, but brought up to be more submissive to her husband, Anne Boleyn comes across as feistier, as someone who's more willing to have an argument intellectually, to hold her own position and to challenge other ideas. And perhaps this is what it was about her that Henry found so fascinating. There's some indication that Henry VIII chooses Anne not just for her sex appeal, but in some part for her perceived virtue and intellectual stature as well. Her influence may be evident in Henry's assertion that individual conscience and scripture can stand against the Pope and the institutional authority of the Church. This is a very Protestant idea, and Anne Boleyn espoused those ideas herself. So it's hard to extricate her influence from Henry's eventual adoption of this position officially himself. It's nevertheless a radical assertion, and it puts Henry VIII and England squarely in line with the ideas of Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, which is then unfolding across Europe and is only going to pick up in speed and intensity. Anne Boleyn's immediate pregnancy after her marriage in 1533 is taken by Henry as sort of divine reassurance. That now that he's put away his brother's wife, he's divorced Catherine of Aragon, his doubts of conscience have been allayed. Because one of the excuses that Henry gave for divorcing Catherine was, I have sinned against God. I've taken someone who is my brother's wife. It's wrong in the Bible. This must be the reason why, after all these years of marriage and so many miscarriages, I still don't have a son. So if I can just get right with God by divorcing this woman who I should clearly never have married, then all will be well. So it must have appeared to Henry at this moment, when his new queen is immediately pregnant, that indeed God was smiling on him and the much looked for son would soon follow. Sadly for Henry, the child that Anne Boleyn delivers as a result of that first pregnancy is a daughter, whose name is Elizabeth, and we'll hear more about her later. Surely this was a disappointment at some level to Henry, but he must have thought that a son would soon follow. Anne Boleyn was Queen of England for just under 3 years when she loses everything. So what changes between this triumphant moment in 1533, when she's finally the Queen of England and the wife of Henry VIII, to the point in the story that is about to unfold where everything collapses under her? Her fall from the king's favor is rapid and sickening, and it's going to take a bit of explaining. It all falls apart in May of 1536. But to back up and understand the events that lead to this moment, it's important to reflect on the last 3 years of Anne Boleyn's marriage to Henry. First of all, it hadn't always been smooth. Anne was a feisty one, and she and Henry are well known to have gotten into arguments and had fallings out at various points. So it wasn't always a smooth and harmonious relationship, first of all. Secondly, Henry's eye had fallen on somebody else in the months prior to May of 1536. This, again, wouldn't have been terribly alarming. After all, shortly after Henry made Anne Boleyn Queen of England, he had replaced her with other women who became his mistresses. So Anne Boleyn steps into the shoes of Henry's former wife and queen, and she becomes the producer of legitimate heirs and the king's official partner. Other women would now become the companions of the king's merry hours and his partners in romantic dalliance. The fact that the king now had other mistresses was not unusual and would not in itself have endangered Anne. Anne becomes pregnant again in the early weeks of 1536. And at this point, as her pregnancy becomes more evident, Henry VIII becomes enamored with another young woman by the name of Jane Seymour. In February of that year, a foreign ambassador goes on record as observing that the king seems entirely besotted by this young woman and is showering her with gifts and attention. On February 29th of 1536, almost 3 years into their marriage, Anne Boleyn miscarries a male child. To Henry VIII, this might have begun to look dangerously like his previous marriage, where he has a new female child and there are miscarried male children, but there's no live son that has yet been produced. However, in the month of April 1536, mere weeks before this drama is about to unfold, Henry VIII is still negotiating with Spain to have them officially recognize Anne Boleyn as his queen, which, as you might imagine, would be a sore point since it was a Spanish princess he'd divorced. Spain would have been perhaps the most reluctant country to recognize the woman who had replaced Catherine of Aragon. But that's the position that Henry is in. He's still officially negotiating for Anne's recognition by Spain, which suggests that he doesn't have any regrets about his relationship with her so far, although he's surely disappointed by the lack of a son. The drama begins just before a May Day celebration in 1536, when Anne Boleyn's musician, a man named Mark Smeaton, is quietly arrested and taken to the house of Thomas Cromwell for interrogation. It seems that a noble woman in the Queen's circle had made some allegations to her brother. There were some comments suggesting that the Queen had been having improper relationships with men. And this comment that was made to the brother was then reported to Thomas Cromwell himself. Mark Smeaton, the musician, was a commoner, not an aristocrat, and so arresting him was an easy place to start because he could be detained and questioned without causing a major stir. And so it seems this is exactly what happened. Now, Thomas Cromwell in 1536 was Secretary of State, having replaced Cardinal Wolsey as Henry VIII's right-hand man. Cardinal Wolsey had been dismissed and disgraced for failing to produce Henry VIII's much-desired divorce from Catherine of Aragon. And so Henry had replaced him with Thomas Cromwell, who had succeeded Cromwell had been the architect of the plan that finally allowed Henry to divorce Catherine and marry Anne. So in addition to his official position as Secretary of State, Thomas Cromwell took it upon himself to act as Henry's fixer. He was the man who drafted legislation to ensure that things that Henry VIII wanted were accomplished, and he also came up with punishments to ensure that people went along with doing what the king required of them. So he was a very powerful man, and he was someone who had few scruples in getting the job done. So when Mark Smeaton is taken to Thomas Cromwell's house for interrogation, it's a serious thing. Under questioning, Mark Smeaton confesses that he has committed adultery with the Queen. Now, questioning in the 16th century was very likely to involve torture, especially for a commoner like Mark Smeaton. There are varying accounts of whether torture was used and what particular methods were used, but it was extremely common, and it's hard to imagine that they wouldn't have employed it on him at some stage. So we have to take Mark Smeaton's confession with a grain of salt. However, no such salt was taken by Thomas Cromwell or any of his contemporaries, for whom torture was thought to be an entirely legitimate way of extracting the truth. So with Mark Smeaton's confession in hand, suddenly the rumors that had been circulating about Anne, particularly because she had many enemies, these rumors suddenly began to resemble facts. And from this point on, the investigation is deadly serious. Other men were named as suspects, possibly by Mark Smeaton, or possibly by some of the other people who had been whispering rumors about Anne's improper conduct. And at this point, Henry is quietly and privately told about the investigation that is now underway. The very next day, Henry turns his attention to one of his closest companions, Henry Norris, who's also a frequent visitor to Anne Boleyn's court. Henry takes Norris on a private boat ride and begins this terrifying line of questioning. What does Henry Norris know about Anne's sexual activities? Has Norris been involved with the Queen himself? And Henry promises Norris a pardon if he will confess entirely what's been going on. But Norris has nothing to confess and must have been astonished and completely gripped with horror at the nature of these questions. Norton confesses nothing, but he's immediately sent to the Tower of London, along with 5 other men who are soon named as suspects in this scandal. These men include the poet Thomas Wyatt, as well as Anne's own brother, George Boleyn. The Queen herself was sent to the Tower that same day, although of course she wasn't confined in the same cell as any of the men. So what were the charges? What were these other men and Anne Boleyn herself accused of? The official indictment read as follows. Whereas Queen Anne has been the wife of King Henry VIII for 3 years and more, she, despising her marriage and entertaining malice against the king, and following daily her frail and carnal lust, did falsely and traitorously procure, by base conversations and kisses, touchings, gifts, and other infamous incitations, divers of the king's daily and familiar servants to be her adulterers and concubines, so that several of the king's servants yielded to her vile provocations. So to translate from the 16th century English, what this is basically saying is that the Queen has continuously been in the business of seducing men around her, of taking men who are the king's good servants and subjects and making them her lovers, and sort of turning them from loyal subjects into treasonous partners in her own lustful projects. The charges covered a period stretching back to October 1533, suggesting that almost from the time that Anne was married, she had been engaged in these malicious and treasonous activities. So Anne Boleyn is accused of sexual relations with all 5 of these men who are currently in the Tower, and one of them is her own brother. Not a half-brother, not a step-brother, but someone that she was raised with. The charges could scarcely have been painted any blacker. We can see that the character that Anne Boleyn is now being portrayed as having is very much like that of a witch. She's used her sexuality as some sort of evil weapon and turned the order of things upside down, taken the king off the path that he should have followed, and then used the same black art to do awful things to the men around her. In fact, the only thing they've really left out is the sacrificing and eating of babies, which is another charge that was standardly leveled at women who were accused of witchcraft. So at this point, the blackness of Anne's crimes is just so overwhelming that many of the people around her can hardly believe that her name is being breathed in the same sentence as some of these acts, which are frequently taken to be unspeakable. And there are some records of commentary around the trial that say that the full detail of some of the accusations and crimes leveled at her was so foul that they even tried to suppress it in sort of the public utterances of the court proceedings. It was that shocking. Now, Anne, as I previously mentioned, had been resented and looked down on by many around her who thought of her as an unprincipled whore who had, usurped the place of the Queen of England and become the wife of King Henry in a very unprincipled way. But even they, her detractors, many of them were shocked by the speed at which this scandal is going to unfold, because it begins on May Day of 1536, and by May 19th, the Queen and all of the principal men accused with her are dead. What we're talking about is a period of less than 3 weeks from the time that an investigation begins to the time that execution is complete. The speed at which heads did roll was dizzying for people at the time, and it still is when we look at the records today. Now, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, he held the highest religious position in England at the time, seeing as the Pope had been removed. The Archbishop of Canterbury was sort of the ranking English prelate, and he owed his position chiefly due to his willingness to officiate at Henry's marriage to Anne. He had been promoted because of his willingness to go along with this plan. He's very much personally invested in Anne Boleyn and her marriage to Henry, and he expresses his astonishment at the charges as well. He writes in disbelief when he hears the charges leveled against the Queen, quote, "If it be true that is openly reported of the Queen's grace, if men had a right estimation of things, they should not esteem any part of your grace's honor," he's speaking to the king, "to be touched thereby, but her honor only to be clearly disparaged. And I am in such a perplexity that my mind is clearly amazed, for I never had better opinion in woman than I had in her, which maketh me to think that she should not be culpable. And as I loved her not a little for the love which I judged her to bear toward God and his gospel, so if she be proved culpable, there is not one that loveth God and his gospel that ever will favor her, but must hate her above all other. And the more they favor the gospel, the more they will hate her. Wherefore I trust that your grace will bear no less entire favor unto the truth of the gospel than you did before. For as much as your grace's favor to the gospel was not led by affection unto her, but by zeal unto the truth." So we can see that there are a number of things going on here in what Cranmer is saying. First of all, he's expressing astonishment and disbelief that his opinion of Anne had been very high, that he finds it very difficult to believe that such a woman as she seems to be could be guilty of the crimes that are attributed to her. So he's sort of remarking at the astonishing gap between who Anne Boleyn seems to be and who these charges paint her as in fact being. But there's also this long series of concerns about the gospel that Thomas Cranmer is expressing. And what he means by that is Protestant versions of Christianity. Thomas Cranmer is part of this Protestant movement in England. He's the Archbishop of Canterbury. His own position is the highest in England because they've gotten rid of the Pope and they've gotten rid of the institutional Catholic Church. So Cranmer is the head of this new Church of England, which is Protestant, which has been brought into being chiefly because the king wanted to marry Anne. So we can see that Cranmer's nervous here, that now that Anne Boleyn has fallen out of favor, will the entire structure and institution that was brought into being to enable her rise to the throne fall with her? Will Cranmer and Protestant Christianity in England be a casualty of Anne Boleyn's virtue? That's what he's really worried about. And so he's hoping to convince the king that Protestantism in England has a right to be there independent of Anne Boleyn, and that even if Anne Boleyn turns out to be a terrible woman, it wasn't a bad thing to make England Protestant for her sake, and by extension, to make Thomas Cranmer the highest ranking religious official in England. So there are all these things going on as well. And Thomas Cranmer wouldn't have been alone in his concern that the fall of Anne Boleyn would have these dramatic implications for this very newly Protestant version of England. There's also a sense that Thomas Cranmer may be attempting to defend Anne in as strong terms as he could get away with. It would be very dangerous for him to say, these charges are unbelievable and they must be wrong, for that would be an accusation against the king and his wisdom, and that would be almost treasonous. So Thomas Cranmer has to be very careful in what he says, but there does seem to be, as strong as possible to word, a reluctance on his part to believe in the charges that are being leveled. And surely he wasn't the only person who thought that either. And we know that Henry had believed in Anne's virtue before, or what scholar Tracy Adams calls her moral authority. That he had often praised this very thing about her in the long 6-year courtship they had had, and said that it was one of the things that made her distinct and superior to other women. So part of Anne's charm for Henry was precisely that she had this virtuous intellectual quality about her. So why would the king suddenly believe that she would be adulterous, and not just mildly so, but flagrantly and maliciously so? The explanation for this might have a lot to do with those prevailing attitudes in 16th century England that held that women were just morally weaker, that they were frailer and less able to resist the lusts of the flesh, that they suffered from very strong and potentially overwhelming sexual desires, and that these dangerous sexual impulses of women needed to be regulated by men, and they had to be protected from themselves, and men perhaps also had to be protected from the unbridled and unrestricted lust that women were prone to. There was also this tradition of courtly love in the Tudor court, and we've mentioned this in previous episodes. Henry VIII was a very active participant in this tradition, but it wasn't something that only men were doing. Women in the court also took part in these very stylized demonstrations of admiration and longing and passion for other people they were not married to. And these sorts of things were also going on in Anne Boleyn's court, meaning the circle of nobles, men and women, her ladies-in-waiting, her musicians, the foreign dignitaries who came to visit. These were the people that Anne Boleyn held court with. She was surrounded by. And these kinds of expressions and manners of speaking were common there too. Women might bestow some marks of affection on their admirers in the form of small gifts or portraits. They might occasionally meet them in secret or step aside for private conversation. And it was very common for men to profess overwhelming admiration for the queen's person, for her physical attributes, for her beauty. And this wasn't invented by Anne Boleyn, but it was certainly going on towards her. And while this may seem odd to us, it's actually not that different from buttering up your boss. It's trying to be in the good books of someone who has the ability to benefit you or to promote you or to put you in an advantageous position. And so there would be all these men in Anne Boleyn's court who would be professing their admiration for her beauty, for saying that, she was the woman that they most desired, that their hearts were overwhelmed with affection for her, even while they were being engaged to and marrying other women. Yet there would be this kind of official admiration for the queen. And in many cases, this would just be the harmless banter of courtly manners, nothing serious. But it's not hard to see how people who wished Anne ill, people who resented her position, might be inclined to interpret a few words in private that she might be seen to be having with a gentleman at the window as evidence that something else was going on. Anne's participation in banter and conversation with these men would have been perceived as normal until someone decided to make a rumor out of it, and then the very same behavior could be viewed as evidence that there was in fact something nefarious going on. Whether Anne Boleyn ever did have illicit affairs is something that historians have spilled a lot of ink over. But it seems to me unlikely that after attaining the throne, after such a long period and overcoming so many obstacles, that Anne would be foolish enough to throw it away in that fashion. I mean, having affairs with men at court would be the best possible way she could ensure destroying everything that she'd worked and waited so hard to gain. And remember, Anne is not being accused of falling for someone and having this one love affair outside of her marriage. Anne is accused of basically having sex with as many men as she can get her hands on in her circle, including her own brother. So the nature of the allegations is almost at the level of ridiculous. It's so unbelievable. But even if some of those allegations are inflated, could it be that any of them were true? I personally have a hard time believing it. It seems to me that if we know anything about Anne Boleyn, it was that she had the patience to wait and to work for a goal that she had in the future. And it seems very strange to me that such a person, after obtaining that goal so recently, would then throw it away with this kind of foolish behavior. This is just my personal view. What we can know, which might be more of an explanation of these shocking events, is that Anne had made some very unwise comments. And these comments provided the fuel that was necessary to take rumors and give them the appearance of reality. Some of these comments had included jokes with her ladies-in-waiting about the king's sexual prowess, or lack thereof, possibly some episodes of impotence on the part of the king, and these would be very unwise things to be joking about. So Anne seems to have had some unguarded laughs with ladies who were her intimate companions, ladies who were her best friends, the people she was surrounded by every day. But to make jokes about the king's performance in bed would be a very unwise thing. And this is something that Anne seems to have done. Also, she might have made similar comments to her brother. Again, her brother would be someone that she could trust. But when you are surrounded by other people who can observe you, and some of these people are malicious, comments and behavior can be radically reinterpreted. And it seems that this is exactly what happened to Anne Boleyn. She even made a very unwise comment to a male courtier named Henry Norris, who was one of the men who ended up in the Tower. It seems to have been along the lines of courtly love banter, that Henry Norris had for a long time expressed admiration for Anne Boleyn and was, in fact, engaged to one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting. And so there's this conversation that Anne Boleyn has with Henry Norris, where she says, well, you're engaged to marry so-and-so. What are you waiting for? And Henry Norris is supposed to have said, well, I'm going to wait a while. I'm not in any hurry to marry this other woman. And then makes some comment about his admiration for Anne. And that Anne picks up on this comment and says something to Henry Norris like, if the king were to die, you would want to marry me. Something along those lines. And at this point, Norris is kind of shocked and horrified, because to speak of the king's death and to speak of things that might happen if the king were to die is a very dangerous overstepping of the line. It almost suggests that one has already thought of and perhaps even desired such a thing to happen. And those are treasonous thoughts. Anne Boleyn herself seems to have realized almost as soon as the words came out of her mouth, possibly because of the expression on Norris's face, that she's gone too far. And Norris responds and says, if I were to have such a thought, I would wish that my head were off my shoulders. He even says to her in the moment, that's treason. We can't be having this conversation. And so they separate, and Anne has time later that day to reflect on what she said and to realize how wildly out of line it looks. And she actually sends Henry Norris the same day. She says, you need to go and swear an oath to the cleric that I give my confession to say that the Queen is a good woman. She has a scent that she's done something that's over the line, that Norris knows it, and that other people who might have overheard or witnessed it know it. And now she's scrambling to try and do damage control. But it's too late. So Henry Norris is one of the men who ends up in the tower with Anne, and the way things turn out for all of them is horrifying. Once there was this rumor that Anne had been having affairs. The things that she had actually said and been witnessed to do, combined with the confession of musician Mark Smeaton, combined to look like damning evidence. Henry himself led the investigations and personally questioned some of the men who were accused, most of them who were nobles. Perhaps it was the reliable accounts of her foolish words that gave credibility to actions that no one had witnessed her performing. Apart from Mark Smeaton, who confessed, probably under torture, that he had slept with the Queen, there were no witnesses who came forward to say anything about Anne physically being involved with any of these men. The story of Anne Boleyn's fall from grace is sordid and unspeakably rapid. The official allegations included not just the fact that she was unfaithful, but that she had very likely plotted against the king's life. She was now a treasonous enemy who had been inciting other people to conspire against the king. Henry VIII also got Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, to declare his marriage to Anne Boleyn null and void because of the impediment of affinity. Now, this really is a bit much. If you've watched the previous 2 episodes, you will know that this impediment of affinity had been a constant feature of Henry's married life up to this point. It was an impediment that had to be removed before he got married, because apparently Henry only chose to marry women who'd been sexually involved with people he was closely connected to. In the case of his previous wife, Catherine of Aragon, she'd been married to Henry's older brother, who died shortly afterwards. And so Henry had to get the Pope to remove this impediment that would now allow him to marry Catherine, who otherwise would be forbidden to him because she'd been his brother's wife. Then, when Henry was finished with Catherine and wanted to divorce her, he wanted the Pope to basically reinstate that impediment and say that that marriage was null and void. It should never have happened because there was this impediment of affinity. So Henry should never have married Catherine because of this impediment. But simultaneously, in the same breath, Henry wanted the Pope to remove another impediment of affinity to allow him to marry Anne Boleyn, who happened to be the sister of Mary Boleyn, his former lover. So this was an impediment that could be inserted and removed at the king's good pleasure to allow him to marry or divorce whom he pleased. So the impediment had been removed in the case of Anne, so they could be married. And now that the king was done with Anne Boleyn, the good old impediment of affinity could be resurrected to show that, in fact, he should never have married her in the first place. In May 1536, roughly 3 years after her dramatic coronation as Queen of England, and less than 3 weeks after the rumors of her infidelity reached the ears of Thomas Cromwell, Anne Boleyn is executed. Her daughter, Elizabeth, is barely 3 years old. The court had found her guilty of the scandalous charges brought against her, and Henry VIII had then been free to execute her by burning or beheading. Mercifully, Henry chose the option of beheading, and he even seems to have gone the extra mile and hired a French swordsman to execute his wife. This spared her the tradition of the English execution, which would have been done with the axe. And in many cases, there were horrific accounts of the executioner not quite finishing the beheading in the first stroke and having to bring it down again on a still writhing victim. So this horror was something that Anne would be spared. And it seems there were even some special arrangements that were made for the moment of execution so that Anne would not perceive the moment when the swordsman approached her, to mute the horrifying anticipation of the very last moments before the blade would fall. A mere 10 days after Anne's head had been cut from her body, Henry VIII married Jane Seymour, the young woman that his attentions had fallen on in the early part of that year. To quote Hamlet, "The funeral bake-meats did coldly furnish forth the marriage table. So small was the time between the executing of his last wife and the formal recognition of a new one." It seems to me that this is the moment that Henry VIII becomes a very different man. If you've been following the series so far, you'll know that in his younger days, Henry is athletic. He's the flower of chivalry. He's wildly popular amongst his subjects. He's romantic. He's an avid participant in courtly love. And he has a fairly finely tuned sensibility for how one should speak to women and how one should treat them. He doesn't come across as a brute or a monster until this moment. And having spent so much time overturning the entire established order, political and religious, in England to make one woman his wife, and having that relationship sour, believing that Anne Boleyn was now this vile and traitorous woman, to whatever extent he truly believed it, and that's another question. There's a possibility that Henry found some of these charges to be convenient. Perhaps he didn't believe all of them, but he might have tired of Anne and decided that having had 3 years on the job and not having produced a son, perhaps it was time to try with somebody else. There's that possibility too. But there's a ruthlessness and a cold, unemotional speed with which Henry dispenses with Anne and creates for himself a new wife and a new queen that chills the blood. And from this point on, Henry is much more cavalier about his changing his women and the human damage that might be caused as a result. In October of 1537, about a year and a half after marrying Henry VIII, Jane Seymour gave birth to a son. At this point, Henry finally has, for the first time, a living and legitimate male heir. A son that he has sired with an official wife as opposed to one of his mistresses. A child who could, without controversy, inherit the throne of England and preserve the Tudor dynasty. Unfortunately for Henry, Jane Seymour dies in the attempt. She doesn't survive childbirth. Henry is a man with 3 wives behind him. Catherine of Aragon, who's been divorced and has died of grief and natural causes. Anne Boleyn, for whom he changed everything in England, who was then charged with treason and executed. And finally, Jane Seymour, who's just died in childbirth. Henry's 2 surviving daughters, Mary, the daughter of Catherine, and Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, have both been declared illegitimate. So while they are the older children, they will not stand in the way of the new son's line to inherit the throne. All Henry's hopes now hang on his new son. Sadly for Henry VIII, the boy, Prince Edward, will not survive into adulthood. The Crown of England will have to find another head to rest upon after Edward's early death. This is when the legacy of what Henry VIII has done is going to become evident in a fight for the soul of England. But for that, and the rest of this story, you'll have to join us for the 4th and final episode in this series on Henry VIII. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the final one, and share it with someone else that you think would enjoy it as well. You can catch this and all the previous episodes wherever you listen to podcasts. You can catch it on Spotify, or you can get the illustrated version on my YouTube channel at Villains and Virgins Podcast. In addition to history podcasts, I also create music, mostly jazz, but other things as well. And you can find all of that if you look for Eva Schubert on Spotify or on YouTube. I hope to see you in the final episode of the series on Henry VIII.